Welcome back, Brother Samuel. Tonight we're diving into a lore of some of the Warhammer's biggest Hive cities. Before we get to that, be sure to like and comment any videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for Emperor. I want to thank you guys for the support. I've been killing it like always. Now, let's get into the video.
In the grim darkness of the far future, a hive city is never merely a city. That word is far too small, far too clean, far too humane for what the Imperium of man builds when it abandons all thought of mercy and devotes itself instead to scale, necessity, and survival, purchased in human flesh. A true hive is a continent of iron and rockcrete driven upward into a poisoned sky. It is a vertical empire whose upper reaches glitter with the cold light of wealth, rank, and inherited dominion, while its lower depths vanish into fumes, rust, sump filth, and the anonymous hunger of uncounted millions. It is a labor engine whose every vent exhales industry and whose every corridor throbs with toil. It is a shrine where incense coils around relics older than nations, and prayers are recited by lips cracked from chemical air. It is a prison in which whole bloodlines are born, spent, and buried, without ever laying eyes upon an open horizon. It is a grave that learned to breathe. It is all of these things at once, and it endures only because the Imperium has forgotten how to build anything less monstrous. This is the first truth that must be understood when one asks which hive cities are the largest in Warhammer 40,000. The question appears simple only from a distance. It sounds like the sort of question one might answer with a data slate, a set of measurements, a neat ranking arranged in orderly sequence. Yet the Imperium is not an age of neatness, and it has never loved precision, except where precision serves taxation, tithe, or death. The galaxy of the God Emperor does not often present itself in the tidy language of modern surveyors. It speaks instead in the swollen rhetoric of administratum ledgers, in contradictory chronicles, in the boasts of planetary governors, in the fearful testimony of those who have seen a spire vanish into cloud or walked for a week through Hab districts that never seem to end. So when one asks what the largest hive city is, one is not asking for a single clean measure. One is asking how scale itself should be judged in a civilization that has turned overcrowding into doctrine and urban misery into a pillar of statecraft. Is the largest hive the one with the broadest footprint, whose foundations spread across leagues of bedrock and whose transit veins stretch farther than old terrestrial kingdoms? Is it the tallest, the one whose highest spires stab at the heavens like the fingers of a dead titan and vanish into smog and ash before the eye can follow them to their summit? Is it the densest, the hive that crushes more human bodies into habstacks, manufactorum warrens, shrine districts, and transit ducts than any rival, until the very walls sweat with breath and recycled heat? Is it the most productive, the one whose foundries birth regiments of armored engines, whose factorums vomit lasguns, shell casings, promethium drums, and ration bricks without cease, whose conveyor arteries move enough munitions to feed crusades and enough corpses to clog crematoria for generations? Or is the largest hive the one whose strategic importance eclipses all others, whose fall would cripple sectors, whose walls anchor war zones, whose existence alone bends fleets, armies, and tithes into obedience? In the Imperium, all of these measures matter, and none of them can be cleanly separated. A hive city is not only a structure, it is also a wound in the skin of a world, a concentration of power, a devouring machine, a statement of imperial will made manifest in ferrocrete and bone. Some worlds bear a single great hive whose shadow defines the planet entire. Others are hive worlds in the full sense, their surfaces scarred by many colossal hives, each one a steel mountain rising from toxic plains, ash deserts, irradiated wastes, or exhausted seas. On such worlds, the distinction between city and state begins to blur, for each hive may possess its own clans, noble houses, guild alliances, enforcer traditions, labor castes, gang ecologies, and inherited feuds older than the reign of lesser emperors. And then there are places like Holy Terror itself, where even the notion of a hive begins to strain beneath the burden of reality, because there comes a point at which urban mass, sacred infrastructure, planetary administration, fortress architecture, and civilizational sediment collapse into one another until the whole world becomes a city, and the city becomes an empire in stone. That is why the problem of scale in Warhammer 40,000 is never simply architectural, it is civilizational. A single hive city may contain more human life than entire star nations of more merciful ages. It may hold nobles in vaulted palaces, and scribes in dust-choked scriptoria, manufactorum serfs bound to assembly lines by hereditary debt, enforcers stalking hab alleys with shock mauls in hand, priests chanting beneath brass icons blackened by centuries of candle soot, underhive scavengers scraping a living, from rust, sump water, and murder, and corpse guild adepts reducing the dead into forms still useful to the living. Such a place is not built for comfort. It is built to process humanity as raw material. Flesh enters it in the form of birth, migration, tithe, and conquest. From its higher levels emerge command, regulation, and privilege. From its middle bands come shell casings, ration packs, tank treads, last cells, promethium filters, textiles, stamped components, and all the blunt instruments with which the Imperium wages its endless wars. From its lowest strata come waste, mutation, criminality, forgotten populations, and the quiet accumulation of dead who will never be named in any chronicle worth preserving. A hive consumes bodies and produces obedience. It consumes youth and produces labor. It consumes faith and produces ritual. It consumes the dead and produces sustenance for those not yet dead. It consumes whole generations and produces ammunition. To understand the largest hives, one must learn to see them as the Imperium sees them, not as hopeful monuments to progress, but as engines of endurance. The central image is always the same, no matter the world, no matter the name etched upon the charts of cartographers and the censors of priests. Above rise the spires, impossibly distant from the filth below, crowned with palaces, great windows, gun emplacements, audience halls, and sanctified chambers, where nobles sip Resyk wine beneath ancestral banners and speak of duty, while never hearing the scream of a line worker dragged into a turbine shaft 10,000 levels beneath their feet. Below those heights lie the hab belts, manufacturing plateaus, transit galleries, storage vaults, guild compounds, barracks towers, and chapel warrens where the true pulse of the hive beats hardest. Lower still begins the descent into the dark. There, the architecture buckles beneath neglect and old war damage. Light grows thin, air grows wet and poisonous. Roads give way to gantries, then to pipes, then to rusted ladders over sump pits of chemical ruin. In those depths dwell the forgotten, the hunted, the mutants, the carrion eaters, the gangs who inherit broken machinery as though it were sacred relic, and the nameless multitudes upon whose backs the hive rests like a mountain built from indifference. This is why the greatest hive cities are not wonders in any noble sense. They are not triumphs of enlightened civilization. They are proofs of the Imperium's central method, which is compression. When mankind could not abolish suffering, it learned to stack it higher. When it could not grant dignity to its countless trillions, it learned instead to arrange them in vertical order, to sort them by altitude, by privilege, by utility, by contamination, by proximity to light and fresh air and authority. The largest hives represent the most extreme expression of this method. Billions packed into hab blocks, where walls thin as paper fail to keep out the drone of machinery. Endless factorums, where laborers age in fumes and sparks before their bodies are reclaimed by the same system they served. Corpse grinders, reclamation vats, ration presses, and polluted transit veins running like clogged arteries through the body of the city. Every level, another layer of need. Every district, another mouth to feed or arm to exploit. Every extension upward or outward, another testimony that the Imperium survives not by solving scarcity, but by organizing it with ruthless efficiency. Yet even among the hives of the Imperium, there are categories of immensity. Some are vast because they spread, their footprints devouring plains, mountain chains, and ancient coastlines, until no natural geography remains visible beneath the sprawl. Some are vast because they rise, each new tier built upon the bones of older levels, until the city becomes less a habitation than a man-made escarpment. Some are vast because of density, because life has been packed into them so tightly that their populations are less counted than inferred, guessed at by tithe tallies and corpse disposal records. Others loom larger in history and consequence than their rivals because they anchor sectors, crusades, pilgrimage routes, or war fronts. Their size is measured in the fleets they provision, the armies they arm, the pilgrims they receive, the bureaucracies they sustain, and the catastrophe that would follow if their reactors fell silent and their walls were breached. So this descent into the greatest hive cities cannot be a crude countdown. It cannot be reduced to a scrap of administratum arithmetic, as though all hives might be lined up and judged by some single sacred measure. The truth is darker and more interesting than that. There is the impossible exception, the place where city and world fuse until the distinction becomes meaningless. There is the classic giant, the archetype that defines what a hive is in the imagination of the faithful and the damned alike. There is the war hive, where urban mass and fortress doctrine become inseparable, and a city is measured as much by the slaughter it can absorb as by the lives it can contain. There are the sector capitals and colossal industrial beasts whose names do not always command the same mythic reverence, yet whose bulk, weight, and political gravity may rival the more famous monsters. And beneath them all lies the final truth that makes the question worth asking at all. Already the great contenders cast their shadows across the thought. Terror, throne of mankind, where urban scale becomes sacred delirium, and no honest tongue can fully separate city from palace, palace from planet, or planet from empire. Necromunda, the deathless archetype of hive enormity, whose towering stacks and poisoned underdepths have become synonymous with the very idea of life lived in vertical misery. Armageddon, whose vast war hives stand as proof that some cities are not merely inhabited but mobilized, not merely crowded but fortified, their every district one alarm bell away from siege. Beyond these names wait others, lesser known only because the Imperium is too immense to catalogue its own horrors in full. Hive capitals of crushing density and monumental importance scattered across the stars like cancers in the flesh of empire. And that, in the end, is the measure that matters most. The largest hive cities are not merely the biggest settlements mankind has ever raised. They are the clearest evidence of what mankind became in order to survive the age into which it stumbled. They show an imperium that did not conquer want, but institutionalized it. That did not abolish suffering, but stratified it. That did not tame the future, but learned how to bury billions inside steel mountains and call the arrangement civilization. The greatest hives in Warhammer 40,000 are not monuments to abundance. They are monuments to organized deprivation. They are proof that the Imperium did not lift humanity above scarcity and torment. It merely learned how to stack both higher. Terror almost breaks the question by existing. Once a whole world has been consumed by urban mass, by the stone weight of empire, by fortress architecture piled upon dead ages, by the movement of pilgrims in numbers so obscene they cease to resemble a population and become a tide. Then the old word city begins to feel frail and insufficient. It feels like a relic from a gentler era, a word suited to plazas and districts and walls that mark a clear edge between habitation and wilderness. Terra has no such edge that matters. Terra is not merely settled, it is encrusted, it is layered, it is entombed beneath its own continuity. It is a world upon which administration, worship, fear, state violence, ceremony, and survival have been compressed until they have become a single planetary fact. To ask whether Terra contains the largest hive city is already to misunderstand the nature of the throne world, for Terra does not simply host a hive in the manner that other worlds do. Terra has become the final form toward which all hive logic tends, a place where the distinction between hive, palace, shrine, fortress, archive, and civilization begins to collapse beneath its own weight. This is why Terra stands apart from every other contender, not because it is free of the same cruelties that define the great hive worlds, but because it contains them all at once and on a scale so vast that ordinary measures recoil from it. The faithful imagine holy Terra as mankind wishes to remember itself, sacred avenues, impossible bastions, cathedra vast enough to humble the soul, processional roads lined with banners, golden iconography blazing beneath the watch of the master of mankind. There is truth in that image. Terra is sacred in the only way the Imperium still understands sanctity, through size, through suffering, through ritual repetition, through the proximity of power so immense it reshapes belief into reflex. Yet sanctity on Terra does not banish squalor. It does not cleanse the lower levels, or lighten the labor burden, or empty the crematoria. It merely crowns them. Above stand the monuments of faith and state. Below them extend forgotten warrens of labor, transit catacombs where the movement of bodies and cargo never truly ceases, crypt infrastructure older than the memory of those who maintain it, utility vaults and archive caverns and hab masses beyond any honest counting. Terra is holy, and Terra is foul. These truths are not opposed, they are fused. That fusion is what makes the throne world imperial, rather than merely municipal. Other hive cities are immense concentrations of human life. Terra is that, but it is also where the Imperium gathers itself into one diseased knot. Here the bureaucracy of a million worlds thickens into scriptoria, vaults, registries, tribunal halls, data crypts, parchment mountains, transmission sanctums, and offices where adepts grow bent and blind over ledgers whose importance may doom continents. Here religion ceases to be an adornment placed atop political power and becomes the atmosphere in which power breathes. Processions of penitents shuffle past processions of officials. Ecclesiastical pomp collides with military necessity. Cargo trains move reliquaries and munitions alike. Pilgrim routes knot themselves around defense grids and ration arteries. Terra is not where people merely live. It is where the Imperium thinks, if such a monstrous apparatus can still be said to think. It is where the Imperium prays. It is where the Imperium files, condemns, allocates, remembers, forgets, and devours. It is less a capital than a planetary wound where every function of the species has festered together. The scale of Terra must therefore be understood as movement as much as mass. No sane reckoning could call its population static. It swells and drains in rhythms too huge for the mind to hold. Pilgrims arrive in unending flotillas, rag-wrapped, ash-caked, fevered, blessed, dying, ecstatic, their entire lives spent for a glimpse of the cradle of mankind and the throne of its carrion god. Adepts stream between departments like blood moving through a diseased organ. Soldiers march to garrison points, ceremonial duties, transit ports, or embarkation fields that feed distant wars. Servitors are trundled in ranks through processing corridors and maintenance shafts, their ruined flesh bearing the load of a civilization that long ago solved labor shortages by mutilating the laborer. Clerks are born in one district, assigned in another, and buried in a third without ever seeing the open sky. Cargo moves in oceanic quantities: food bricks, parchment bales, promethium cells, purity seals, machine components, funerary wares, shell casings, shrine offerings, uniform cloth, replacement parts for systems so ancient that their original makers are dust. The movement never ends, because it cannot end. A pause on Terra is not inconvenience, it is collapse. At the heart of this impossible organism squats the Imperial Palace, though even the word palace is almost an act of deception. To the untutored imagination, it suggests residence, throne rooms, perhaps a fortress around a seat of rule. The palace on Terra is that only in the most skeletal sense. In truth, it is a devouring landmass of walls, battlements, audience halls, sanctums, archives, vaults, hidden roads, barracks, cathedra, reliquaries, command posts, gardens preserved by ancient mechanisms, oubliettes, armories, crypts, machine chambers, and internal systems layered over older systems, each age burying the previous one without ever truly erasing it. It is fortress architecture, swollen to civilizational size. It is not simply built upon the earth, it seems to have replaced a portion of the earth. Behind its walls lie not only authority and sanctity, but logistical organs, defensive ecologies, and whole populations whose sole purpose is to keep the vast body functioning for another hour, another day, another century. It is the citadel of mankind, and also a parasitic kingdom that feeds upon the world around it, drawing in labor, tithes, prayer, material, and blood. This is the sacred image from a distance, the palace as the heart of humanity, Terra as the holiest of worlds. The reality beneath the monumental facades is almost certainly more terrible than most pilgrims can bear to imagine. For every processional stair, there are maintenance shafts, crusted with old grime and incense soot. For every soaring cathedral vault, there are lower districts, where the air tastes of metal, fungus, chemical runoff, and recirculated breath. For every gilt icon, there are starvation quarters, where work-clades sleep in shifts beside hot pipes, and wake to another cycle of toil beneath lumen strips that never truly mimic daylight. There are generations born under ceilings they will never see the top of, and beneath superstructures they will never leave. There are transit hollows where the dead are dragged aside before the next tide of bodies tramples them flat. There are exhausted labor cadres feeding reactor complexes, filtration systems, archive repositories, and manufactoria whose products will never belong to those who make them. The glory of Terra is real, but it is supported by a substructure of deprivation so vast that it disappears into the foundations of the myth. This creates a problem of fairness when one speaks of the largest hive cities in all the Imperium. If Terra is included without qualification, it threatens to dominate the entire discussion by sheer impossibility. The throne world is so swollen with urbanity, so interlaced with sanctified infrastructure and imperial apparatus, that other hives begin to look like mere expressions of the same logic on a lesser scale. Yet to exclude Terra would be dishonest. It would be an act of convenience masquerading as rigor. Terra may not fit neatly into the category of Hive City, but that is precisely why it must be confronted. It is the point at which the Hive ceases to be merely a type of city and reveals itself as an entire mode of civilization. Terra forces the question into its truest shape. When does a city become so large, so integrated with state and creed and war, that size alone is no longer the right measure? That is why Terra redefines what largest means in the age of the Imperium. Largest is not merely the broadest footprint, or the highest spire, or the most overcrowded hab stack. Largest, in the grim logic of this setting, may instead mean the place where urban scale merges with imperial theology, where architecture is inseparable from worship, where bureaucracy hardens into geology, where every corridor is both a route of transit and a vein in the body of empire. Terra is vast in every physical sense, but its true enormity lies in function. The world is not only inhabited, it is interpreted, sanctified, processed, defended, administered, mythologized, and endlessly fed. Its size is measured in how much of humanity's burden it attracts and how much of humanity's delusion it sustains. The throne world is a city of cities, a hive of hives, the final shrine of a species that has mistaken magnitude for destiny. In that sense, Terra is the ultimate expression of excess in the entire setting. It is an urban carcass still functioning because untold billions continue to feed it with labor, with paperwork, with rations, with fuel, with pilgrimage, with military service, with belief, and with their own dead. Every promise the Imperium makes about glory is visible there in monumental form. Every lie it tells about dignity is visible there as well, if one looks beneath the banners and the incense smoke. Terra survives because it consumes. It shines because others are ground down in its lower dark. It remains the holiest world in mankind's domain because the species has poured so much sacrifice into it that the distinction between reverence and mass immolation has long since become academic. The planet is a reliquary, but it is also a machine pit. It is the center of human power and the most damning proof of what human power now requires. So Terra must be acknowledged as the impossible upper limit, the case that almost breaks the frame and yet defines it. It is not a contender in the same way as the more recognizable giants. It stands above them and outside them at once, not as a fair comparison, but as the terrible horizon toward which all hive logic points. Once Terra has been faced and named for what it is, the path becomes clearer. Then the descent can begin in earnest, away from the throne world's singular madness and toward the true archetypes of hive form, the colossal cities that still resemble what most minds imagine when the word hive is spoken with dread. Only then can one turn to the steel mountains of worlds like Necromunda, to the fortress hives of Armageddon, and to the lesser-known but no less monstrous capitals scattered across the Imperium, each one a more familiar face of the same immortal cruelty. If there is a single world in the vast dominion of the Imperium that most perfectly seizes the imagination whenever the words Hive City are uttered, it is Necromunda. Not because it stands alone in magnitude, for the Imperium is swollen with monstrous cities and planet-wide sprawls of steel, smoke, prayer, and suffering, but because Necromunda presents the hive in its purest and most merciless form. When the mind reaches for that quintessential image of mankind, stacked in tiers of hierarchy and deprivation beneath towers that claw at a poisoned sky, it is most often reaching toward Necromunda, whether it knows the name or not. This is the classic giant. This is the iron mountain upon which the Imperium built 1,000 lesser nightmares. This is the hive world as archetype, as symbol, as warning, and as accusation. Terra may be the impossible exception, where world and city collapse into one another beneath the weight of empire. But Necromunda is the form in which the hive becomes legible. It is the pattern others echo. It is the shape of the wound after the screaming has stopped and the scar has hardened. Its great hives rise from the ash wastes like the work of a species that forgot how to build for anything except endurance, extraction, and domination. They are not mere urban clusters set upon a landscape. They are the landscape, or rather, the replacement of landscape by human appetite made permanent. Each hive is a vertical kingdom of metal and ferrocrete, a man-made mountain raised not by idealism, but by industry, faith, hereditary violence, and the long habit of forcing the weak to hold up the strong. From a distance, a hive on Necromunda does not resemble a city in any familiar sense. It resembles a cliff face, fashioned by machinery and cruelty, its bulk layered with battlements, towers, exhaust stacks, antenna forests, shield, projectors, chapels, loading gantries, transit lines, and parapets so ancient that no living architect recalls their first design. It rises through smog and chem haze, through wind-blown ash and industrial fallout, until its upper reaches are lost behind cloud and glare. Around it the wastes lie blasted and bitter, stripped of any beauty the world may once have possessed, as though the hive has devoured all that was green and spat back only rust. To speak of a necromundan hive is to speak of stratification carved into physical space. Its uppermost reaches, the spires, are the realm of noble houses, guild compacts, private soldiery, ancestral wealth, ceremonial privilege, and all the old fictions by which power convinces itself of its own refinement. There, far above the smoke belts and hab warrens, the air is cleaner, the chambers wider, the walls adorned with relics, tapestries, weapon racks, sigils of bloodline and patronage. Men born to the summit speak of duty, lineage, etiquette, and stewardship, while beneath their feet, entire populations break themselves to sustain the illusion that such men were placed higher by merit rather than by centuries of violence calcified into law. The spire gleams, but it gleams because it is held aloft by darkness. That is the first lesson Necromunda teaches. Altitude is not beauty. Altitude is theft made architectural. Beneath the spires sprawls the immense industrial body of the hive, the middle reaches where the true life of the city labors without glamour and without respite. Here the hive ceases to pretend that it exists for ceremony and reveals itself as a machine. Manufacturum belts run for distances so great that a worker may know only his own section of line and never comprehend the totality to which his life has been chained. Ore arrives through cargo shafts and mag-rail arteries from the dead skin of the world and from deeper mines below. Promethium is pumped, refined, stored, blessed, contaminated, and burned. Weapon. Parts are cast, stamped, bored, filed, riveted, proofed, sanctified, and packed for wars fought light years away by soldiers who will never know the names of the men whose lungs blackened forging their rifles. Hab towers crowd together in suffocating ranks. Transit shafts scream with elevators, conveyors, haulers, cable trams, and service lifts. Pipework sweats in the heat. Lumen strips flicker behind grime. Shift sirens toll like mechanical cathedral bells. The hive lives here, if such a word can be used for existence, reduced to labor cycles, ration queues, chapel attendance, and the narrow sleep afforded before the next horn sounds. Yet even to describe these middle reaches as the heart of the hive is only partly true, for Necromunda's enormity is felt not merely in height or breadth, but in age. The hive is ancient in the way only imperial things can be ancient, not cleanly preserved, but accumulated, layered, buried, and built over, until time itself becomes another structural material. Whole levels have been sealed off for centuries or millennia. Others have collapsed under the stress of war, neglect, sabotage, seismic convulsion, or the simple truth that no man can keep perfect count of such colossal weight forever. Some sectors are abandoned but not empty, left to vermin, some predators, feral outcasts, and the whispering folklore of those who dwell above. Some survive only in gang legend, in half-remembered maps inked on flensed hide, in the muttered boasts of scavengers who claim to have walked beneath dead domes where old machines still hum in the dark. Necromunda is a living city, entombing dead cities inside itself. Each new layer rises upon prior ruin. Each fresh thoroughfare cuts through forgotten galleries. Each noble house draws wealth from strata of labor, whose original foundations may predate its present heraldry by uncounted generations. There are places within the hive where the past has not passed, but merely sunk lower, still pressing upward with all the weight of its bones. This is what makes the spire such a profound lie. It is not false in the sense that it does not exist. It is false because it pretends to stand apart from the rest. Refinement, dynasty, ceremony, cultivated speech, polished marble, private gardens under sealed glass, dueling halls, galleries of ancestors, state banquets, processions, audiences, contracts, marriages of advantage, all of it perched atop multitudes who will never see so much as the shadow of such luxury. The spire tells the story the hive wishes to tell about itself. It speaks of continuity, order, noble stewardship, and the superiority of those who rule. Yet the higher one looks, the more grotesque the deception becomes, because every square measure of clean floor and every breath of filtered air has been bought by the choking, bleeding, and shortening lives of those below. The summit shines only because the depths are blind. The dynasty endures only because the workers die fast, enough to be replaced. The banquet silver is polished by hands that shake from malnutrition. The noble's sigil remains untarnished because somewhere below, a line of exhausted men in stained rebreathers and cracked gloves feed another furnace with raw material and prayer, descend from the spire, and the lie gives way to mechanism. In the industrial middle, the hive's appetite is plain to see. This is the domain of ore smelters, promethium distilleries, shell foundries, reprocessing plants, machine shrines black with sacred oil, hab slabs packed with families bred to task, guild compounds defended like forts, loading stations where freight hangs above chasms on winding chains, weapon manufactoria whose output bleeds into the arsenals of houses, enforcers, gangs, militias, and the wider imperium alike. Here, the population is less a citizenry than a workforce stratified by craft, debt, hereditary obligation, and the measured worth of calloused hands. Men rise, labor, queue, pray, consume ration paste, breed, sicken, and die within a radius so tight it might be mistaken for the orbit of livestock. Every corridor echoes with the sounds of a civilization grinding its own people into usable forms. Every heat shimmer from a foundry grill is another sermon on the truth of Necromunda, that utility outranks life and output outranks dignity. This is where the city sustains itself. This is where the giant keeps moving. Not in the balconies of the spire, but in the cramped manufactorum aisles and soot-thick galleries where men disappear into the scale of the process. Lower still, and the order of the hive begins to rot into something more honest. The underhive waits beneath the official city like a second kingdom born from neglect, violence, mutation, and adaptation. Here, the architecture no longer resembles planned habitation, but the aftermath of survival. Tunnels split from tunnels. Gantries rust through and are replaced with planks, chains, scrap plate, or desperate faith. Sump seas congeal beneath old industrial runoff, black and luminous in places, breeding things no sane flesh ought to share the dark with. Broken domes hold stale air and scavenged light. Water drips from ancient pipework into barrels guarded like treasure. Whole settlements cling to the edges of forgotten shafts or nest inside the carcasses of obsolete machinery. Carrion economies thrive on what the upper hive discards. A snapped blade becomes inheritance. A functioning lumen strip becomes wealth. A crate of spoiled ration bars becomes cause for murder. Here the law of the houses frays into little more than distant rumor, and authority is enforced instead by gang marks, ambush lines, local strongmen, territory shrines, and the promise that weakness will be flensed down to the bone. The underhive is where Necromunda reveals the full cost of its own age. Generations of abandonment have created a realm where the empire above is known only through its refuse. Forgotten weapons resurface in the hands of killers who barely understand their machine spirits. Half-collapsed manufactorum chambers become gang fortresses. Mutants, outcasts, pit fighters, chem addicts, scavengers, sump hunters, and mad preachers all carve domains from the rot. Predation becomes culture because scarcity leaves no room for gentler customs. What is discarded above becomes sacred below. What is broken above becomes livelihood below. The underhive feeds on the forgotten scraps of empire, and in doing so, becomes one of the most vivid proofs that the Imperium does not eliminate failure. It buries failure under fresh construction and forces the buried to invent their own brutal ecosystems. In those depths, one can walk through the corpse of a prior age and hear, somewhere behind the walls, the industrious thunder of the living hive still pretending it has no connection to the dead one. Necromunda therefore serves as a perfect case study in the true scale of a hive, because it allows one to understand size through inequality. Its immensity is not only a matter of physical dimension, though those dimensions are staggering enough. Its deeper immensity lies in the number of realities it contains, stacked one atop another, each with its own laws, languages of survival, assumptions, and blindness. The noble in the spire and the ganger in the sump may technically inhabit the same city, yet they live in conditions so radically severed from one another that the term shared habitation feels almost blasphemous in its dishonesty. The hive is vast because it is divided. It is immense because it is layered by rank, by labor, by access to air and light and force. It is physically gigantic because it is morally gigantic in its indifference. On Necromunda, architecture itself becomes theology. The higher one stands, the more one is told one deserves to stand there. The lower one falls, the more one is taught that survival alone is its own form of absolution. That is why Necromunda remains perhaps the clearest classic giant in the entire setting. It is not merely a big city. It is the hive rendered in its most recognizable, most brutal, and most symbolically complete form. It contains multiple worlds within itself, all but severed from one another, all feeding the same colossal body, while scarcely acknowledging the others as kin. The spire dreams of nobility. The middle toils in heat and smoke. The underhive hunts in rust and darkness. Dead levels sleep beneath living ones. Forgotten crimes fossilize into infrastructure. Whole civilizations nest inside the shell of the current order. In Necromunda, one sees the hive not as an abstract category, but as a total way of life, a mountain of steel and suffering so immense that its inhabitants can spend their entire lives within it, and still know only one narrow stratum of its truth. And yet, for all its enormity, for all its violence, for all the ceaseless predation that festers in its lower dark, and the hereditary cruelties enshrined in its heights, Necromunda still represents the hive in a kind of diseased equilibrium. It is decay in peacetime. It is oppression at rest, if such a thing can ever be said to rest. Its brutality is endemic, internal, habitual. The next descent will show what becomes of giant hives when the wider wars of the Imperium hammer upon them from without, when the city no longer serves merely as engine of labor and stratification, but as fortress, bastion, siege line, and sacrificial wall. For if Necromunda shows the giant hive in its pure archetypal form, then Armageddon will show what happens when such a place is forced to remember that in the far future there is not only squalor, hierarchy, and industrial misery, but war without end. Armageddon's great hives are not merely large cities in the manner of Necromunda's vast industrial towers, nor are they only concentrations of labor and rank swollen to monstrous proportions by the habits of the Imperium.
Be sure to subscribe. You know you want to. If you don't, you'll be sent into the void and nobody will find you for the rest of your life. So go, be sure to subscribe. Remember, subscribe.
They are war cities. That distinction matters. It matters because there are hive worlds where suffering has become routine, where hierarchy is built into the bones of the steel and the smoke, and the people move through their allotted misery with the dull obedience of generations bred to confinement. Armageddon is not content with such static cruelty. Its greatest hives have been built, scarred, fortified, burned, rebuilt, and fortified again in the expectation that one day the horizon will blacken with invaders, the Vox will fill with casualty liturgies, and the walls will have to prove whether all that labor and iron and sacrifice were enough to hold back extinction for one more hour. A hive on Armageddon is not only a city, it is a siege waiting to happen. It is a fortress that has learned to speak in the language of population density. It is a military doctrine cast in ferrocrete and fed with human lives until it becomes indistinguishable from urban planning. This is what gives Armageddon its own terrible category of scale. Other hives rise high. Other hives spread far. Other hives crush more people into narrower spaces and more efficiently convert existence into labor. But Armageddon reveals another measure of enormity, one that only becomes fully visible under bombardment. Here, the city is judged by how much war it can absorb without ceasing to function, by how many regiments it can raise from its hab blocks and labor guilds, by how many shells it can manufacture while districts burn, by how many wounded it can process, how many refugees it can redirect, how many breaches it can seal with masonry, armor plating, and men ordered to stand shoulder to shoulder until the guns fall silent or the last of them is pulp beneath treads and boots. When one speaks of the great hives of Armageddon, Hell's Reach among them and its sister giants beyond, one is speaking of places where industry and siege architecture have fused so completely that the line between city and fortress has been obliterated. Consider what such a hive must be in practical form. Not merely towers and hab blocks, not merely manufactoria and transit shafts, but a fortress industrial organism whose every layer has been taught the grammar of war. Curtain walls rear up like the flanks of a mountain range, thick enough to swallow barracks, magazines, maintenance routes, and nested defensive redoubts within their own substance. Void shields shudder over districts like invisible domes of stubborn faith, flaring against incoming fire, while reactors groan under the strain. Gun batteries sit in ranks above hab oceans, their emplacements blessed with incense and sacred oils, while loaders in stained uniforms sweat and curse beneath shell hoists that never rest. Macro transit lines slash through the body of the hive like arteries, designed not for comfort, but for speed of deployment, for the movement of troops, fuel, rations, armor, munitions, and the dead. Factorum districts hammer out the tools of war beneath cathedral vaulting blackened by soot. Refinery sectors belch fire into the ash-laden air. Habitation zones contain human beings by the million, but even these are never purely civilian in spirit, because every worker is a future conscript, every corridor a future fallback line, every plaza a future casualty station, every sump tunnel a future ambush route or burial trench. That is what Armageddon teaches that Necromunda does not. On Necromunda, the hive feels ancient and predatory, a vertical civilization rotting in place, stratified by custom and inherited violence. Armageddon does not rot in the same way. It mobilizes. Its brutality is less that of old social disease and more that of permanent readiness. The city waits beneath the weight of its own preparations. The shell racks are full because they may be needed by dawn. The walls are reinforced because someone remembers the last breach and the screams that came through it. The refineries run because tanks must move, and generators must hold, and the guns on the battlements must never fall silent for want of fuel. Every siren tower and watch bastion whispers the same doctrine. War is not an interruption here. It is the assumption around which the hive has been arranged. This transforms the very way scale is perceived. In a lesser city, a district burning is catastrophe enough to define a generation. On Armageddon, a district may burn for weeks, its hab blocks gutted floor by floor, its avenues cratered into trenches, its shrines collapsed into flaming rubble, while the wider hive continues to grind onward around the wound. In a lesser city, a wall is a boundary. In a war hive, it is a front. It has sectors, command nodes, secondary revetments, reserve gun pits, coded demolition charges, fallback galleries, internal kill lanes, and regiment designations attached to every stretch of stone and steel. In a lesser city, an underpass or freight tunnel is infrastructure. In Armageddon's hives, an underhive transit tunnel can become a charnel trench where men and invaders butcher one another in darkness, lit only by muzzle flare, burning promethium and the glow of ruptured conduits. And still the hive continues deeper. Still there are more sub-levels, more service routes, more maintenance corridors, more abandoned chambers, more old foundations beneath the current ones, more places to retreat into, die in, fortify, lose and retake. War does not merely attack the city, it reveals how much city there is. Nowhere is that more evident than in the way civilian life and military necessity blur, until separation becomes almost meaningless. On Armageddon, there may still be workers, clerks, hab-dwellers, shrine keepers, labor overseers, enforcers, and guildmen going about routines that in a softer age might have been called ordinary. Yet once the alarms sound, ordinary life is not suspended so much as translated into military purpose. The same trains that carried raw materials begin carrying shell crates, medici-cots, and columns of fresh troops. The same manufactoria that produced industrial components are turned wholly toward replacement barrels, armor plate, power cells, siege parts, and emergency repairs. Hab blocks become billets, schooling halls become triage wards, chapels become rally points and morgues in the same night. Civil authorities vanish into command structures or are absorbed by them. Smoke from factories mingles with smoke from bombardment until the sky no longer records which deaths belong to labor and which to battle. The whole hive becomes one vast apparatus of ammunition, exhaust, evacuation, rationing, blood loss, prayer, and slaughter. This is not urban life adapting to war. It is urban life revealing that it was always built with war in mind. The cruelest truth within that revelation is that the great war hives survive by burning human life twice. First, the people are fed into furnaces of labor. They mine, refine, forge, rivet, package, transport, ration, maintain, and endure. Their youth is spent in heat, fatigue, and pollution to keep the colossal machine provisioned. Then, when the sirens howl and the enemy draws near, those same lives are fed into the furnaces of battle. Men who 1 week worked assembly lines or cargo cranes or hab maintenance routes are issued flak, a laze gun, a belt of ammunition, perhaps a prayer strip if the quartermaster has any left, and are sent to a wall sector or transit junction or barricaded avenue where they become another layer of fuel for the city's continued resistance. The hive does not change its nature when war comes. It merely alters the form in which it consumes its people. In peace, it uses their hands. In siege, it uses their bodies. This is why Armageddon feels so different from Necromunda, even when both are plainly enormous beyond reason. Necromunda is social stratification made geological. It is hereditary inequality stacked layer on layer until the architecture itself becomes a class system. Armageddon is mobilization wrapped around urban mass. The inequality is still present, the labor still brutal, the crowding still suffocating, the lower levels still dangerous, and the upper sectors still better defended and better supplied, but all of it exists under the shadow of external war. The hive is not simply a machine for keeping the weak beneath the strong. It is also a machine for turning a population into a garrison at a moment's notice. Its size is therefore experienced not only in the number of its inhabitants, but in the scale of its readiness, in how much ammunition it can store, how many troop columns it can move, how many bunkers it can hide behind civic facades, how many wall guns can answer at once when the horizon erupts. And here lies the chapter's central truth. Some hives become larger in narrative terms because war exposes their inner anatomy. A peaceful or merely oppressive city can conceal its full dimensions behind, Routine. Work shifts pass, cargo moves, administrators stamp permits, nobles feast, gangers kill each other in the lower dark. The immense whole remains partially hidden within habit, but once invasion begins, every artery of the city lights up with visible purpose. Rail systems become lifelines. Armories yawn open and disgorge reserves accumulated over decades. Wall sectors are named in casualty reports. Sub-levels once ignored become battlegrounds in their own right. Corpse counts rise so high that ordinary language ceases to carry meaning. Crematoria choke. Identification collapses. Entire battalions vanish in precincts that still remain only one district among many. What would annihilate an ordinary city becomes on Armageddon a phase of resistance. The Hive is so large, so compartmentalized, so layered that it can absorb devastation on the scale of lesser nations and still have enough depth left to continue the fight. That is why Hell's Reach and its sister giants loom so large in the imagination of the Imperium. They are not merely famous because they were attacked. Many places in the galaxy are attacked. They matter because they make visible the awful strength of the Hive form under military pressure. They show what a city becomes when every street may become a bastion, every rail line a supply vein, every district a battlefield, every temple a rally point, every refinery a target, every hab block a future pyre. They show that in the far future, a truly great hive is not just a place where mankind lives badly. It is a place where mankind is prepared to die in industrial quantities without interrupting production. Once Armageddon is understood in that light, the path ahead broadens. Terra has already stood apart as the impossible limit, the throne world where city, shrine, bureaucracy, fortress, and myth collapse into one planetary enormity. Necromunda has shown the archetype of the classic giant, the vertical kingdom of inherited cruelty and stratified existence. Armageddon has shown the war hive, the city whose scale is fully grasped only when the shells begin to fall. But the Imperium is too vast and too diseased to end with only its most famous exemplars. Beyond these titans lie other monsters less often spoken of, sector capitals and industrial hive beasts whose names do not always dominate the same tales, yet whose mass, density, and strategic gravity may rival the celebrated giants. To understand the full breadth of hive enormity, the gaze must now widen beyond the famous war zones and legendary worlds toward those colossal urban engines that headline fewer sagas yet may be no less monstrous for their obscurity. One of the most Warhammer things imaginable is that some of the largest hive cities in the galaxy are barely spoken of at all. They do not always stride across the setting with the same mythic weight as Terra, Necromunda, or Armageddon. They do not always arrive preceded by the roar of green hordes, the thunder of famous sieges, or the sacred dread of the throne world. Instead, they linger in the half-light of the Imperium's own impossible scale, glimpsed in campaign ledgers, buried in sub-clauses of administratum record, named in the margins of war reports, or mentioned once in the account of some doomed official whose world vanished into ash before his testimony could be filed properly. There is something profoundly fitting in that. This is a setting in which the largest empires forget their own limbs, in which 1 billion deaths can be reduced to a parchment notation, in which a city vast enough to swallow nations may remain little more than a sidebar, because somewhere else a greater fire is already burning. The obscurity of these colossal hives is not an argument against their importance. It is evidence of the Imperium's madness. A civilization this bloated cannot even keep proper count of its own greatest wounds. Beyond the famous names lies a category of hive that reveals another face of enormity, the sector capital hive. These are cities whose true mass cannot be measured only in altitude, footprint, or population, terrible though those may be. Their scale is also administrative, commercial, strategic, and gravitational in the political sense. Such a hive does not merely dominate its own horizon, it drags whole regions of space into its orbit. Tithes are calculated with it in mind. Trade lanes bend toward it. Regiments receive their orders through it. Judicial decrees issue from its halls and spread across worlds that will never glimpse the towers from which they came. Fleets refuel because its ledgers demand they do so. Merchants prosper or starve by the decisions made within its counting houses. Pilgrims, clerks, enforcers, naval personnel, adepts, preachers, inspectors, and condemned men all pass through it in numbers so great that movement itself becomes one of its defining features. A sector capital hive is large not only because of how many bodies it contains, but because of how many obligations, permissions, punishments, shipments, and campaigns must pass through its grasp before the wider machine can continue its groaning advance into another day of rot and war. That is why places like Scintilla and its immense hive complexes matter so much when one widens the lens beyond the legendary exemplars. They may not be mythologized in the same way as Necromunda's spires, but they throb with the same crushing logic, and in some respects demonstrate it more clearly because their power is so bureaucratically suffocating. Cybellus and Tarsus do not need the theatrical silhouette of a singular death world icon to communicate oppression. Their weight is felt in density, in pollution, in institutional pressure, in the way the city bears down upon the human soul, not only through industrial labor, but through law, paperwork, scrutiny, class division, and the quiet certainty that every avenue, hab district, transit causeway, and manufacturum quarter ultimately serves a hierarchy too immense to be understood from below. A man can be buried beneath smoke in a famous hive and still imagine himself part of a story. In a place like Cybellus, he is just as likely to be buried beneath administration. That has its own kind of horror. The city does not merely work him to death. It records him, classifies him, taxes him, licenses him, judges him, loses him in a registry error, then reclaims his remains through a department so old and overburdened that no one involved remembers the first reason it was established. These lesser celebrated hive monsters often become enormous, precisely because they are indispensable. A city may swell into enormity not through simple chance, but because too much depends upon it. Consider the legal center, where arbitration, tithe compliance, criminal adjudication, inheritance disputes among noble houses, mercantile sanctions, and the endless adjudicative sludge of the imperium accumulate into monumental institutions that require districts of clerks and vaults of evidence and barracks of armed personnel merely to function. Consider the naval nexus, where docklands, factorums, fuel depots, warehousing sectors, commandaries, astropathic sanctums, and garrison compounds expand until the city around them becomes inseparable from the fleets they service. Consider the shrine world whose urban mass swells beneath pilgrimage, where cathedral infrastructure, reliquary districts, pilgrim camps hardened into permanent habitations, corpse processing, food distribution, medici stations, and devotional economies all layer upon one another until sanctity itself becomes another kind of overcrowding. Consider the manufacturum capital whose reactors, foundries, assembly halls, cargo lifts, smelteries and labor blocks matter so profoundly to supply chains that the death of the city would echo across crusades, frontier wars, and entire sectors starved of ammunition, engines, replacement parts, and fuel. In each case, the hive becomes vast, because function has made restraint impossible. The Imperium does not build small when necessity begins to swell. It piles more metal on top of the problem and feeds more lives into the answer. This is one reason even a single hive can feel like the death of a nation when it falls. Verven Hive and others like it prove that the phrase single hive is often misleading to the point of absurdity. It sounds singular only because language has failed to keep pace with scale. A single hive may contain enough people to populate kingdoms, enough industrial base to sustain armies, enough hab infrastructure to swallow generations, enough roads, rails, storage vaults, service tunnels, command centers, militia depots, shrine precincts, and logistical arteries to resemble an entire state compressed within one defensive shell. When such a place is besieged, broken, or consumed by war, the destruction does not feel local. It feels continental. It feels sovereign. It feels as though a piece of the Imperium's own anatomy has been hacked away and left twitching in the dust. The fall of such a hive is not merely the loss of buildings. It is the loss of municipal memory, industrial capacity, legal authority, labor lineage, transport networks, food reserves, water systems, and the frail routines by which millions convinced themselves that tomorrow would resemble yesterday closely enough to survive it. Yet it is important to understand that largeness among these other hive monsters takes different forms. Some are broad in the literal sense, their urban spread consuming such enormous tracts of land that distance itself becomes part of daily tyranny. To live in one district and work in another may require hours of transit through packed rail lines and smog-choked causeways. Whole zones can develop distinct identities, not because they are politically independent, but because the distances between them are so punishing that regular passage feels like migration. Other hives are vertical beyond ordinary comprehension, their internal altitude functioning like a caste system written in steel. Above, somewhere lost in haze and reflected lumen glow, nobility and upper officials live in controlled climates and hereditary insulation. Below, the laboring masses and enforcer sectors grind against one another in the mechanical middle. Far beneath, the lower depths rot into sump dark, gang rule, feral scavenging, and sealed histories. Then there are those hives whose effective size exceeds what any simple map can express, because density and industrial saturation warp perception. A district may not appear broad on a chart, yet contains stacked hab towers, internal sublevels, tunnel markets, machine shrines, processing lines, water reclamation systems, and burial infrastructures so compressed that the lived experience of space becomes one of endlessness. The city does not have to spread far to feel bottomless. This is where the Imperium's fondness for functional monstrosity creates the strangest hybrid forms. There are places where the line between hive and forge complex becomes nearly meaningless, where every civic district is bent around production quotas and machine priest authority until the city feels less inhabited than operated. There are hives that are also fortresses in all but name, their walls thick with defense guns, their transit routes designed as troop channels, their gate sectors able to endure bombardment that would erase lesser capitals from existence. There are penal concentrations whose population is swollen by convicts, hereditary criminal castes, indentured labor corps, and the armed institutions required to keep them productive long enough to die useful deaths. There are cities that serve as shrine, manufactory, prison, naval storehouse, and fortress all at once, because no sane planner was ever permitted to simplify them. Imperial urbanism does not ask what form would be humane, elegant, or sustainable. It asks only what function must be preserved, and then it heaps infrastructure, workers, walls, pipework, barracks, chapels, and corpse disposal systems upon the site until the resulting mass can continue performing that function by force of inertia and terror. This makes room for a possibility that is not merely plausible, but almost inevitable. Entire classes of giant hives likely exist in the background of the setting without ever receiving proper illumination. The Imperium is too vast, too layered, too contradictory, and too negligent toward its own record-keeping to catalogue cleanly. There must be hive capitals on worlds no chronicler has properly described, where the local governance of subsectors is managed from citadels the size of mountain chains. There must be old industrial hives whose names have been eclipsed by more fashionable war zones, even as their foundries continue to arm campaigns across the stars. There must be shrine megacities whose pilgrim populations swell and contract like diseased lungs, their avenues clogged by devotion and plague in equal measure. There must be remote military hubs where hive populations exist almost entirely to supply nearby fronts, men born into shell production and buried in uniform before ever seeing anything but rail yards, hab corridors, and gunmetal skies. There must be forgotten monsters whose populations are guessed rather than known, whose lower levels have not been surveyed in centuries, whose upper administrations have no real understanding of the dead civilizations sealed beneath their own offices. Far from weakening the setting, that uncertainty is part of its power. Warhammer 40,000 works because it constantly implies more than it can ever fully enumerate. A hive city that has been measured, mapped, and completely explained may still be grand, but it loses some of the old poison. The imagination thrives in the half-known. It thrives in the suggestion that there are cities so large and so old that even the Imperium that built them no longer comprehends them as totalities. A governor may rule the upper tiers and yet know nothing of the sealed ecologies beneath his feet. An administratum archive may possess tithe projections accurate to the grain and still have only crude estimates for how many souls actually crowd the lower habs. A war report may note that a given district is lost without ever clarifying that the district in question housed more men than a pre-imperial civilization could field in all its wars combined. This partial unknowability is not a flaw in the world, it is the world. The Imperium is defined by systems too vast to understand from within, and the greatest hives are among the purest examples of that scale, made habitable by desperation. That is why the less discussed giants deserve a place beside Terra, Necromunda, and Armageddon. They remind us that the famous names are not singular miracles of excess, but merely the best, known faces of a wider pathology. The hive form repeats because the Imperium repeats its sins. It builds where it must, piles labor atop labor, fortification atop habitation, sanctity atop pollution, paperwork atop starvation, and then marvels only when some outside catastrophe draws attention to the result. The nameless or lesser-known hive monsters are often the most revealing because they show how routine the impossible has become. A city does not need to headline a crusade or feature in every catechism of law to be monstrous. It only needs to exist under imperial logic long enough. And after naming these giants, after widening the frame beyond the obvious legends and peering into the other colossal hive beasts lurking in the margins of the setting, there remains one final turn more terrible than all the rest. It is not enough to know which hives are broadest, tallest, densest, most indispensable, or most strategically weighted. It is not enough to admire their scale as one might admire the bulk of a battleship or the age of a fortress wall. The last task is to strip away grandeur altogether and ask what such scale means for the men trapped inside it, what it means to breathe the air of these places from birth to death, what it means to inherit a ceiling instead of a sky, a ration queue instead of a future, a machine siren instead of dawn. The true horror of the largest hive cities is not that they are big, it is what that bigness costs in human terms, and how completely the Imperium has learned to call that cost normal. So the answer, when all the smoke is stripped away and the grandeur flensed from the bone, is uglier than the question first suggests. The largest hive cities in Warhammer 40,000 are not the Imperium's greatest achievements. They are its greatest mass graves still pretending to be alive. They are not monuments to human triumph, except in the most diseased and accusatory sense of triumph that the far future can still permit. They are what remains when a species survives long enough to forget the difference between endurance and damnation. They are cities only because language has not yet found a harsher word. In truth, they are stacked cemeteries of the living, mountains of laboring flesh arranged in tiers beneath iron heavens, each level pressing down upon the one below, each generation spent to preserve the illusion that the thing is still functioning by right, rather than by inertia, terror, and the continual feeding of bodies into the dark. It scarcely matters in the end whether one places terror above all as the impossible upper limit, whether one points to the great hives of Necromunda as the classic iron mountains of inherited cruelty, whether one lingers on the war cities of Armageddon, where every district can become a siege front, or whether one widens the eye to the immense sector capitals and lesser-spoken hive monsters whose true scale is buried under clerical neglect and the Imperium's own inability to comprehend itself. The exact order is less important than the civilization they reveal. Each of them, in its own fashion, tells the same truth. Each is a machine for compressing human life into usable forms. Each is an altar built from necessity and maintained through indifference. Each is proof that the Imperium of Man no longer builds to elevate humanity, but to contain it, tax it, arm it, punish it, and bury it in numbers so large that the dead become part of the architecture. That is the hidden cost of scale, and it is never truly hidden from those forced to live within it. It is there in the air itself, thin, stale, recycled through ancient filters clogged with dust, soot, spores, oil, and the breath of generations. It is there in corpse starch pressed into ration bars and consumed without ceremony by men too exhausted to care what the meal once was. It is there in ration lines that wind through hab corridors at shift change in the bowed backs and sunken eyes of workers waiting for another allotment of grey sustenance that will keep them standing just long enough to report to the line again. It is there in pollution storms clawing at upper structures, in chem rain needling rust from exposed metal, in sump runoff crawling through lower channels thick with industrial poison, sewage, and the bloated remains of things too useful to waste and too ruined to save. It is there in the failing machinery that no one fully understands any longer, ancient systems patched with prayer, sealant, sacrificial labor, and the hope that they will hold for one more cycle before bursting steam, fire, toxins, or collapse into the faces of the men ordered to maintain them. It is there in overcrowded habs, where families sleep by shift, because the room cannot hold them all at once, in the cough that never goes away, in the lesions raised by chemical exposure, in the blackening lungs of forge workers, in the blind eyes of scribes, in the bent spines of haulers, in the quietly normalized misery so complete that no one wastes breath naming it unless they are drunk, dying, or already halfway to heresy. And always, above all else, there is the lie of altitude. The hive climbs, and in climbing it pretends to refinement. The spires glitter in filtered light. Noble palaces rise above the smoke. Administrative citadels and shrine crowns tower over the belts of labor below. The city tells itself that height means worth, that the summit is proof of order, lineage, sanctity, and control. Yet the higher the city climbs, the more suffering it has buried beneath its own foundations. Every polished hall at the summit is supported by levels of toil so numerous they cannot be counted honestly. Every clean chamber above depends upon stale air below. Every banquet laid out beneath heraldic banners is purchased with the shortened lifespan of men who will never see a window. Every spire is a needle driven upward through strata of hunger, violence, disease, confinement, and exhaustion. The city's glory does not float above the misery. It rests upon it. The spire is not separate from the underhive. It is what the underhive has been forced to hold aloft. That is why every extra district, every new level, hammered onto old foundations, every transit artery punched through the body of the city, every factorum district expanded to meet tithe quotas, carries with it more than mass and statistics. It implies more anonymous workers born into air that tastes of rust and solvent. It implies more children lost in corridor labyrinths, in gang crossfire, in labor drafts, in transit accidents, in hab collapses, in quiet abductions, No one bothers to investigate because disappearance is simply part of urban metabolism at such scale. It implies more gangs feeding on the scraps and blind corners of imperial neglect. More enforcers beating order into crowds already half broken by the labor cycle. More servitors dragged from processing lines with their humanity stripped out for efficiency. More men burned in machinery, more men crushed in lift shafts, more men worked to death under lumen glare, more men knifed over water rights or corridor tolls, more men consigned to the wrong side of a sealed door during contamination lockdowns, more men whose names survive nowhere except in the brief grief of a bunkmate and the redistribution of their ration allotment. Every expansion of the Hive expands not only infrastructure, but the radius in which a human life can vanish without record. This is the deepest obscenity of the Hive City. It endures not because it is humane, wise, or worthy of admiration, but because the Imperium has become expert at converting human life into maintenance fuel for systems too vast to reform. Men are the grease in the gears. Men are the hands that patch the ducts, haul the shells, bless the machine housings, clean the blood from the loading bays, carry the ledgers, stand the walls, recite the litanies, drag away the dead, and take the place of the man who did all of those things yesterday and is now little more than ash in the reclamation stack. The Imperium cannot save the Hive because the Hive is one of the forms the Imperium itself has taken. To reform it would require the admission that this civilization is not merely harsh, but structurally damned. So instead, the machine continues. It swallows men and emits order, munitions, taxes, paperwork, prayer, and smoke. It calls this stability. It calls this duty. It calls this the sacred labor of mankind. In another setting, the greatest cities would symbolize achievement. They would be evidence of abundance, ingenuity, prosperity, and the ability of civilization to draw many lives together in something greater than mere survival. In Warhammer 40,000, the meaning has inverted until it is almost blasphemous to remember that such things were ever possible. Here, the largest cities symbolize managed collapse on a monumental scale. They are proof that the species did not transcend its worst instincts, but industrialized them. They are evidence not of progress, but of a civilization that has learned how to keep failing forever without ever fully falling apart. That is the genius of the Imperium, if the word genius can be used for such a charnel miracle. It has mastered the art of living in conditions that should have killed it long ago. It maintains systems no sane empire would permit, powered by cruelty no sane people would mistake for necessity, and it survives because there are always more bodies to stack into the breach. Look again at terror in that light, at the throne world revered as the seat of mankind. The grandeur remains, but it curdles. The holy avenues, the bastions, the cathedra, the palace itself swollen into a devouring continent of walls and sanctums, all of it stands only because uncounted billions feed the planetary wound beneath. Look at Necromunda, the archetypal hive, and the lesson grows no kinder. Its spires of noble pretension are only the visible crown of a structure rooted in poison, gang war, hereditary labor, and dead civilizations entombed beneath the living one. Look at Armageddon, and the logic becomes openly military, almost refreshingly honest in its brutality. There, the Hive does not even pretend to exist for comfort. It exists to raise, arm, move, and bury men at a scale that would reduce lesser worlds to silence. Then look beyond the famous names to the sector capitals, the bureaucratic carcasses, the indispensable manufactorum monsters, the penal hives, the shrine swarms, the forgotten urban cancers, bloated with trade routes and law and soot and misery, and the picture clarifies fully. The Imperium repeats itself because this is what it knows how to build. It knows how to make suffering permanent and call it order. So when people ask which hive cities are the largest, what they are really asking is not only a question of dimensions. They are asking where the Imperium's cruelty is most physically visible, where its theology of necessity has taken its heaviest architectural form, where its indifference can be walked upon, level by level, hab by hab, tunnel by tunnel, until the answer ceases to be abstract and becomes a smell, a cough, a cue, a stain on a wall, a corpse on a conveyor, a child with soot in his teeth, a ganger with a knife made from salvage, an enforcer with a shock maul, a line worker asleep standing upright because the shift horn has not yet sounded and he cannot afford to fall. The greatest hives do not hide what the Imperium is. They reveal it. They are cathedrals of compression, each one built from the premise that human life is the cheapest material available, and therefore the most useful. And perhaps that is the final image that should remain when all the rankings have been spoken and all the names laid out, like condemned men awaiting sentence. Not a map, not a diagram, not a clean tower profile or a ledger of population estimates. Instead, imagine a steel mountain in the dark, so vast its summit is lost in smog and its roots vanish into sump and buried ruin. Imagine billions stacked one above another, hab upon hab, district upon district, prayer above labor above filth, above the dead. Imagine the walls sweating rust in the heat of reactors and human breath. Imagine shrine bells tolling through the same air that carries the stink of corpse rendering, exhaust, machine oil, and gang blood. Imagine the faithful kneeling before the image of a corpse god, while beneath their boots the lowest levels gnaw upon the remains of the fallen, because nothing in such a city is ever allowed to go to waste. Imagine the whole thing still moving, still grinding, still feeding itself with men who do not know anything else. That is the final truth. The greatest hive cities in Warhammer 40,000 are not wonders of mankind. They are monuments to the fact that mankind survived the future by making hell habitable.